sciences in general, has been through a process of deconceptualization in the last decades, in which descriptive narratives seem to be taking an important role within our fields. And I feel that many people are giving up the task of explaining large-scale, long-term social change. But here today, I'm honored to have as our guests invited speakers coming from different areas of social science, philosophy, history, and anthropology, who in different ways have refused to follow this tendency in their work. Doing empirically and historically grounded research, they all have been trying to revise received wisdom on what we understand as modernity and modernization, on what we understand as the origins of capitalism, or on what we understand as the so-called transition debate from peasant economies to market-driven social relations. Speaking from specific viewpoints and disciplines, they have built knowledge meaningful to many disciplines across the field of humanities and social sciences. Their work helps us conceptualize capital as a historical changing category. In different ways, they all do it. And in this sense, they all invite us to understand capitalism as a social system in which we definitely need to constantly historicize what seems to be static, or to have no history, or to be what may be called frozen history. Institutions or categories like slavery, peasant economies, and time itself belong to this static image that we have of those phenomena. Our first speaker today is Professor Dale Tomich from the Sociology Department at Binghamton University, from which he has retired. Tomich's writings are widely known among Brazilians, especially for the concept of second slavery, coined in one of his articles in his book, Through the Prisms of Slavery, através do prisma da escravidão, Work, Capital, and the World Economy. It was translated into Portuguese and published here in 2011. Tomich, as you see in the morning, those were here, saw it, actively participated in the development of the Fernando Rodel Center and has been a key person in the making of the UF Center on Global Inequalities. So, Dale, you are our first speaker. I'm very happy that you are with us this afternoon. And the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas.
We're not. Yeah, we're starting to hear you.
Okay. That could be good or bad. I don't know. Thank you, Thomas. I'm just delighted to be able to participate in the first conference of the center. I know how much work you put into it, and congratulations. And I hope this is the first of many, many more. I want to make some remarks today about some discussions I've been having for a long time with Max Tomba and with Thomas about temporality in history, and then also my own work on capitalism and slavery. And it's motivated by my idea that I think we need to understand capitalism and slavery in a much more long-term and broader perspective than we usually treat it, and treat the ways in which they can be connected to one another. That seems to elude much of the discussion. Where I'd like to begin is a quote from Marx that, for some reason, hasn't attracted nearly as much attention as it ought to. It's the beginning of chapter 4 of Capital. Marx there begins the chapter saying, world trade and the world market date from the 16th century, and from then on, the modern history of capital starts to unfold. This ultimate product of commodity circulation is the first form of appearance of capital. I think that turns upside down all of the assumptions that are commonly made about transitions to capitalism and production and markets and what capital itself is. Here we have to see it as a long-term, geographically comprehensive concept and as a historical relation. The 16th century world market, in my view, marks the beginning of the long-term history of capitalism. And it's the structure that embraces all its subsequent changes and transformations. And if we think about a world market in the 16th century, the other thing that is striking to me is that it entails a multiplicity of forms of commodity production, including slavery, in which wage labor and capital is not the dominant form. So all the assumptions we usually make about transitions don't really obtain here. This passage, I think, allows us to delineate the historical processes of capitalist development. The world market of the 16th century, let me stop. Am I going too fast for the translator? Can someone tell me? No? Yes? Okay, I'll try to slow down a bit. The world market of the 16th century synchronized the relations among various forms of commodity production. It set in motion historical processes of capital accumulation whose outcome is the dominance of wage labor and industrial capital. But that outcome is the outcome of a global and comprehensive process. The emergence of wage labor and industrial capital as a dominant relation in the world economy resynchronizes commodity production and exchange and restructures the world market. So we have to look at this as a product of changing relations and not a static thing. Within these long-term processes, I suggest we can identify 3 historical cycles of slavery, which more or less correspond to Giovanni Arrighi's cycles of accumulation. The first is slavery in the formation of the world market, where the Brazilian sugar and slavery in Brazil is the key location. And it's what Arrighi calls the Genoese cycle of accumulation. And I'm going to call it Baroque slavery for reasons you'll see in a bit. The second cycle, from the formation of the world market to the emergence of industrial capital, what Arrighi calls the Dutch cycle, had its center in the French and British Caribbean and was organized by mercantilism and Enlightenment thought. And this third cycle is after the Industrial Revolution, what Arrighi calls the British cycle of accumulation. And the key sites, it's what we've called the second slavery. The key sites are US cotton, Cuban sugar, and Brazilian coffee. Here, the dominant paradigms were political economy and comparative advantage. So that's the big outline. I want to focus the rest of the discussion on a work that many of you undoubtedly know well and probably better than I, João André Antonil's Cultura e Opulência no Brasil. This is, Antonil wrote in the 17th century as the world market was making a transition or consolidating in the 16th and 17th century. He wrote at the end of the sugar part of his book at the end of the 17th century. And he combines a treatment of social relations on the sugar mill with the treatment of the material and technical analyses of the sugar market. It's important to note that Antonil wrote as before political economy existed as a discipline. He was a Jesuit. His book is a moral and ethical guide for the administration of the sugar mill along Christian principles. He wrote it at the conjuncture of a long-term history of slavery in the West that goes back to classical antiquity, together with the formation of the world market. So two historical times are coming together. And in this long tradition, Aristotle's conceptualization of the relations between master and slave is the dominant intellectual paradigm for understanding slavery. Antonil wrote within the framework of the Jesuit mission to the Americas, and Jesuit teaching synthesized Aristotle with Christian doctrine. Here, the secular history of slavery in the sugar mill in Brazil were subordinated to the Christian conception of historical time. In the Christian conception, the last judgment signifies the end of time itself. It is the end of history. It provides absolute meaning for all earthly situations, and all earthly events are interpreted in relation to it. Here, slavery and the sugar mill may be perceived even as they're made unimportant. And I want to add here that here in the 16th and 17th centuries, the justifications for racial slavery were also theological. The story of the children of Ham or Vieira's fantastic eschatological interpretations of slavery. Antonil attempts to contain the new conditions of sugar production, racial slavery, and the world market within the Aristotelian concept of oikos. The Jesuit interpretation of Aristotle structured Antonil's efforts to provide moral, ethical norms of conduct that would guide the señor in the governance of the ingenio. Antonil grounded his conception in Aristotle's formulation of the patriarchal authority of the oikos. The conception of oikos provides the means of integrating new historical experience, historical experience of the Brazilian sugar frontier into the unchanging narrative and temporality of the Christian concept of historical time and the last judgment. Antonil's effort to interpret his empirical description of the ingenio through moral and ethical precepts of the church relativizes the secular history of the ingenio, sugar production, and racial slavery, and subordinates them to the Christian concept of historical temporality and last judgment. If we look at the oikos for the second, the purpose of the oikos was the good life. It was not acquisition or what Aristotle calls primatistica. Aristotle's moral and ethical code is intended to provide norms of moral and ethical conduct for good governance of the sugar mill. It prescribes the obligations and duties of all the members of the oikos under the paternal authority of the masters. Each is treated according to their station. The task of oikos management is to maintain the balance of unequal relations among the groups comprising the household, including the slaves. Antonil makes a comprehensive analysis of the sugar mill within the framework of the oikos. He delineates the dense web of reciprocal duties and obligations through which it operates. Through his treatment of the ingenio as oikos, Antonil confronts the problem of 17th century Atlantic slavery with the conceptual tools of the late Middle Ages. He's unable to think beyond the Aristotelian categories of oikos and proportional justice. Consequently, he sought to contain the new relations of the ingenio into the old categories of oikos. The oikos categories, of course, serve the theological interpretation as well as the secular interpretation. This is the big contradiction within Antonil, I think. In Aristotelian terms, the ingenio once embodies both oikos and crematistica. The internal organization of the ingenio has the form of oikos, but its purpose but the purpose of its productive activity is crematistica, the acquisition of wealth, that is to say, the accumulation of capital on the world market, or someone's accumulation of capital. So you have this dichotomy between the internal principles governing the ingenio or the sugar mill and its embeddedness in the world market. And so in Aristotelian terms, it just doesn't work. Here, Antonil remains imprisoned within the theological conception of historical temporality. He cannot recognize the ingenio as slave plantation producing for the world market, but must instead treat it as oikos, even as the Aristotelian concept of oikos is emptied of its original content and distorted by its application entirely to crematistica in the new historical context of the world market. Antonil is unable to surpass the long-term mental structures of Aristotle and the theological interpretation of history at the same time that he describes and acts in the new times of the slave plantation and the world market. He's therefore compelled to integrate commodity production, racial slavery, and the world market within the concept of oikos. The Christian concept of historical temporality, with its definite beginning and definite end, at once it coexists and clashes with the secular, open-ended, social material temporality of the ingenio and slave commodity production, increasingly regulated by crematistica, or more accurately, the accumulation of capital. That is the temporality of the capitalist world market. Antonil's inability to embrace the new results in what Robin Blackburn calls Baroque slavery, the increasingly elaborate representation of new phenomena within old categories, because you can't break through the wall to get to the other side and recognize the new as new. Well, Antonil's attempt to contain the relations of commodity production, slavery, and the world market within the Aristotelian category of oikos appears to be anachronistic from the point of view of the world market. It reveals a deeper unity of plantation slavery and world capitalism, continually reproducing itself through their contradictory relation to one another. While he fails to adequately account for slave labor as a form of commodity production for the world market, he accurately describes the relations of domination and personal dependency that characterize the relations between master and slave on the plantation. Antonil's approach allows us to posit the relation of slavery and capitalism not through the pre-capitalist capitalist binomial, but rather as a contradictory unity that is historically formed and reformed through its own processes. While Antonil's attempt to contain the relations within the Aristotelian category of oikos appears as the great contradiction within his interpretation of the ingenio, it reveals the unity of plantation and world market continually reproducing itself, and what Reinhard Koselleck calls the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous. So within this framework, what I would like to argue is that the Aristotelian conception of master-slave relations remains intact throughout slavery, because as Marx tells us, slavery is a relation of domination. And I follow here the work of Antonio Barros de Castro. There is no internal economy within the ingenio. Because there's no category of labor. There's a category of slaves who are compelled to work because they're owned as through their domination as enslaved people. So there's the internal calculations are quite difficult. And the only way you can, as the market expands, the only way you can alter the internal organization of the plantation on any significant scale is to add more slaves and more land. Since the slaves are owned, the relations are fixed. Slaves, in Marxist terms, is not variable capital. So what this in fact does is highlight the importance of moments of the expansion of the world market and geographical expansion into new areas as the moments in which the organization of slave plantation production can be reorganized. You go to a new space, reorganize production around sugar or some other crop, and adapt the slave labor force to it. So that's where I think we get the three cycles of slavery within the broader pattern of capitalist accumulation. But what I think is interesting about Antonel's argument is that each successive cycle of expansion and restructuring of the plantation in response to the increased pressure of the world market, or in each of those successive cycles, the application of the Aristotelian conception of oikos to the plantation, pioneered by Antonel, was successively appropriated and interpreted by slave holders in new historical circumstances. Each successive iteration of the concept enabled slaveholders to order and justify the relations of domination and subordination through which the social life and productive activity of the plantation was organized. But secondly, and at the same time, the interpretation of the slave plantation as oikos enabled slave-owning elites throughout the Americas to appropriate Aristotle to construct their own image of their own past. They elaborated an image of themselves as the bearers of an aristocratic agrarian order based on natural hierarchy and paternalism with its roots in classical antiquity. This they could oppose to the urban industrial model proposed by the capital wage labor sector, or industrial capital, let us say. That's not so good either, but let's put it that way. To put it more simply, they created their own image of themselves as pre-capitalist and pre-modern. This self-image runs through each successive iteration of the plantation and unifies the historical temporality of modern capitalist slavery by recreating the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous. It constitutes a difference, but a difference within a unity. Thank you. Thanks.
Sure. Yep. That's it. I think it's like
Dale, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure that the students were thrilled while listening to you. We're gonna move next before we open to the question and answer sections. And our second guest speaker is Professor Tanya Lee from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto, Canada, where she holds the Canada Research Chair on the Political Economy and Culture of Asia. Professor Lee has a consistent production on the agrarian economy of Indonesia in all its dimensions, the environment, class struggles, and state policies and actions. Her book, Lands and Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier, published in 2014, is about the adoption of capitalist relations by small farmers in Indonesia and has become a benchmark in Southeast Asia studies. And Professor Lee's work has been translated into several languages, Indonesian, French, and the Chinese. We are very happy and honored to have you with us this afternoon, Professor Tanya Lee. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be. Field is
Yes, is it right?
three different microphones.
Okay, great.
There's always something.
Yeah. Obrigado, Rafael.
Thank you. So my field is anthropology, not history, and my area of interest is Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, Indonesia. Some of the questions that I will be addressing, though, have a lot of resonance with those which Dale has just presented, so it's a good idea to follow his. So the title of my talk is Provincializing Theory, Dynamic Farmers and Dead Plantations in Indonesia. So the challenge which was set for us in this panel is how to read capitalism against the grain. That was the title. Or, put differently, how can our empirical research in different times and places contribute to theorizations of capitalism, what it is, how it works, and how it can be managed to be less destructive? For post-colonial scholar Dipesh Chakrabarty, for one, every location of theory building is provincial, he argues, shaped by the spatial and temporal coordinates of its site of origin. So to provincialize theory is to draw attention to these coordinates, which are often masked by claims that theories have a general relevance, and try to consider not, as Thomas said, how we abandon theory, but rather what different kinds of theory might be generated from a different, although albeit probably equally provincial location. So that's my orientation here. So in my field then, so what is the grain of theories of capitalism in my field? In my fields, economic anthropology, development studies, agrarian studies, the grain, I would say, the mainstream of analysis, the established way of theorizing capitalist relations is in terms of transition, understood as a linear process that moves just in one direction. Thus, for example, agriculture moves from traditional to modern, from small scale to large scale, from low tech to high tech, and from pre or non-capitalist relations to capitalist ones. So that kind of transition is the standard narrative about capitalism in my discipline. Implicit in this transition narrative is a moment of violence or rupture in which the past must be swept away so that new relations can be set in place. So, for example, a prominent theme in agrarian studies has been the subsistence orientation of so-called peasant producers and the role of force, whether in the form of enclosure or rent or taxation or debt or direct coercion, in breaking down their autonomy or fracturing their so-called natural economy so that capitalist relations can be set in place. This is a common narrative, right? That you have subsistence-oriented peasants, and someone comes along and taxes them or pushes them off their land through enclosure, or somehow forces them to start to live differently and to produce differently. But for reasons I will explain, in island Southeast Asia, the area of my research, force was not required to push farmers, or in fact was not used to push farmers into markets. Rather, force was used quite systematically to push them out. So what I'm offering is a rupture of this dominant narrative in which people are naturally not involved in markets, but when forced, they become so. In fact, I will argue that in Southeast Asia, it has been the opposite. So in this talk, I want to provincialize the agrarian transition narrative and also the binary categories on which it rests: traditional, modern, low-tech, high-tech, small-scale, large-scale, etc., in order to suggest a different way of theorizing capitalism from the perspective of this region. To do this, I draw on two conceptual sources. One is the work of Malaysian historian Syed Hussein Alatas, who wrote a brilliant book called The Myth of the Lazy Native, in which he examined the colonial origins of the racialized narrative that classified native producers as traditional, backward, irrational, and unproductive, contra much historical evidence. So that's one source of inspiration. The second source is theorizations from scholars studying what we might think of as the Black Atlantic, that foregrounds the role of plantations in the formation of the modern world, such that, as some have argued, we are living in a plantationocene, a world that plantations made. But this theorization gives the social, political, and racial entailments of the plantation format a far greater importance than being merely an example of the modern, the high-tech, the large-scale, or the capitalist, which is where plantations are situated usually, wrongly, I would say, in these transition narratives. So I want to start, in my analysis, I'll draw on both historical and some ethnographic data, but I want to start to give you with some pictures, just to give you a sense of where we are in the world, what I'm talking about. I think since I'm here in Brazil and talking about Southeast Asia, this could be helpful. Just a very brief visual tour.
Okay. Does he need to hit the button?
Okay. I can't control.
Rafael, será que é você que muda o slide? Pelas setas não está dando.
So here we are, Southeast Asia, the Indonesian archipelago, massive area of land and water. And this is a scene from the book of one of my books called Land's End, about cocoa farmers in Indonesia. These people did something quite remarkable. If you look at this diagram, this shows global cocoa production, cacao, from 1980s through to the 2000s. And these lines are the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, the traditional homes of cocoa production. But the blue line is Indonesia. So it went from zero to the third largest global producer of cocoa in a period of 2 decades. And it did so entirely through the work of people who lived in mountains like this, very rugged terrain, no roads, no infrastructure as such, and who had tiny little cocoa farms like this. So people living in extremely modest houses, This is a family with 200 much-loved cocoa trees, but it's precisely small-scale farmers like this that produced, in this period of 2 decades, a massive boom in production of cocoa. So that's one figure in my narrative, is the market enthusiastic producers of global market crops with a massive global presence, although its origins are extremely humble. In the second work I will refer to, which is my more recent book called Plantation Life, which I co-authored with an Indonesian scholar, Pujo Sumadi. So we're talking about a different kind of capitalist formation in Indonesia as well. So this is a map of Indonesia, and the red areas on the map, which is a huge area, is 1/3 of all of Indonesia's agricultural land, which has been given to plantation corporations for the production of oil palm. So this is, again, a massive transformation of rural society, but of an entirely different kind, driven by large-scale plantation corporations that have saturated huge areas of the countryside and occupy 22 million hectares, 1/3 of Indonesia's agricultural land. So the plantation format in Indonesia is not a figure of the past. It's present, it's contemporary, it's expanding, and it is completely transforming life for at least 15 million people, probably more. This is what the landscape looks like under contemporary plantation agriculture. The land is flat, everything is flattened, all the trees and villages are removed, producing a linear landscape, or if it's hilly, it will be terraced. But either way, that's interesting. These are the mills for crushing the oil palm fruit. And I want to end with this picture. This is a village of the customary landholders in one of our research areas. Behind this is oil palm. And what you can see is that the customary landholders are left in a tiny, tiny little piece of land on the edge of the river. All of their agricultural land has been taken by the plantation corporation. So that's what it means to, actually I see this map did not work. Okay. To live in a plantation zone and what this form of agriculture produces. Okay. We can, perfect. All right, so this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of the landscape and the two very different kinds of forms of production of global market crops that I'll be describing. So I want to start with what I call dynamic farmers, or we might think of as capitalism from below. As it turns out, Indonesia's small-scale farmers have been highly efficient suppliers of global market crops such as coffee, cacao, sugar, and rubber to global market crops for at least 300 years. An early crop boom occurred around 1710 when the first coffee seedlings arrived in Java. Farmers enthusiastically planted the crop, but within a few years, their production was suppressed by the Netherlands East Indies Company, which was the vehicle of colonial rule at the time. The colonial power imposed a monopoly on the transport and sale of the cocoa crop, or the coffee crop, and it replaced the market price with what it called a coffee allowance that was so low that farmers who had enthusiastically planted coffee burned their coffee bushes in disgust. Over the next century or so, coffee and later sugar production had to be coerced by the colonial power. So that, one could say, is the origin of what Said Hussein Alatas calls the myth of the lazy native. You could say that the myth is circular. A racialized colonial narrative assumed that the natives were lazy, that they were not willing to plant more than they needed for survival. Therefore, they had to be coerced to produce a surplus to pay colonial rent and taxes, etc. But because they were coerced and effectively made to labor for free for the colonial power, they did indeed become lazy and unproductive. So in that sense, the myth of the lazy native is a racialized version of the transition or modernization narrative. It assumes that the natural economy must be forcibly broken for a surplus to be produced, but the sequence is backward. Force pushed native producers out of market production, and force was then needed to make them work for free. Whenever native farmers were free from coercion and permitted to sell at the global market price, they produced efficiently and enthusiastically. Whenever they were able to get real money for their work, they did continue to produce. Over the past 3 centuries, there have been smallholder-based crop booms for coffee, cacao, cloves, coconut, rubber, and most recently, oil palm. After 1870, the colonial power started to issue land concessions to European investors to install plantations. The rationale, again, was the myth of the lazy native. It was the idea that natives cannot produce efficiently, so modern rational plantations must take their place. A crucial legal arrangement enabled this to happen, one which was common across the colonial world at the time. It was the declaration of all land not held as individual private property as state land, a move that weakened or eliminated customary land rights and enabled the granting of plantation land concessions to European investors. So the myth of the lazy native was again central here. If natives had in fact been understood to be capable of efficient production of global market crops, there would be no need for plantations. So the entire presence of plantations hinges on this racialized premise that the natives are not competent, not interested, and not able to produce this global market crop at scale. Therefore, you are justified in sweeping them aside and granting the land to plantation corporations. Yet the history again shows that colonial plantations were in fact repeatedly outcompeted by smallholder producers who tended to be more efficient. They had lower costs per hectare and often more production per hectare as well. So rubber, for example, which as you know was stolen from Brazil, but rubber was introduced in Indonesia in 1906 as a plantation crop, but by 1938, 60% of Indonesia's rubber was produced by smallholders. They basically stole seedlings from the plantations, planted them in their own fields, and by 2000, 80% of the rubber is smallholder based. And in this case, then the plantations went bankrupt. They were outcompeted by the smallholders, which was a problem for them, right? Because their whole legitimacy depends on the myth of the lazy native, which is now being challenged. So depending on the details of their land and labor relations, the small-scale, enthusiastic commodity producers that I've described may or may not be, strictly speaking, capitalist in form. If one adopts a definition of capitalism in terms of the submission to market discipline. Very often, smallholders pay competitive prices for land, for labor, and credit, and inefficient smallholders go bankrupt. Hence, one could say they are involved in a kind of capitalism from below. In the case of the boom in cacao that I studied in the 1990s, these people whose mountainous terrain I showed you and whose tiny cocoa farms I showed you, they claimed their cocoa groves as individual land holdings, and they quickly came to the end of their land frontier. From then on, they met the threshold for the definition of capitalism provided by Robert Branner and Alan Wood, which they mark as the shift from engaging in market as an opportunity. You know, you have a piece of land, there's a good price, you have a good crop, market as opportunity, to market as compulsion, as in now I have only a small area of land. If I'm going to hold on to my land, I have to maximize the production that I can get from it. And if I fail in this, I will in fact lose my land. And this is precisely the process that I saw during the 20 years that I followed this development. This sequence, though, does not always occur. If land is abundant, failed commodity producers can in fact retreat into subsistence when markets are down or their venture fails, and then they can start again. So smallholders, I'm arguing, produce global market crops under quite different conditions. They're always market engaged, they're producing global market crops. Some do so in terms of market opportunity, and some in fact do so on the basis of compulsion. But either way, they are the drivers of their engagement in this form of production. So to recap my argument so far and to clarify how it provincializes transition narratives and enables us to read capitalism against the grain, I'll make a few points. First of all, no violence or coercion was needed to break open natural economies and force peasants into global market production. They entered voluntarily and enthusiastically where conditions permitted. Second, there's no linearity to this. Rather than a subsistence orientation as the beginning of history, I would argue that a subsistence economy emerged historically as the outcome of colonial policies, when the colonial powers suppressed farmers' commodity productions, for example, their rubber production, their cocoa production, their coffee production. What emerges is what may appear to be a natural or subsistence economy, but it is in fact the result of a period of suppression, direct suppression in some cases, or in other cases, neglect, the failure to build a road or to enable a harvest. Third, where land was abundant, failed farmers could also retreat into subsistence production to ride out periods of low prices or failed farms. But this too was cyclical, a movement in and out of markets rather than a linear transition trajectory. Drawing on Alatas's work, I emphasize the colonial origins of the idea that peasants or natives or indigenous people are a distinct social type, culturally oriented towards subsistence. And I've argued that the idea of native laziness or native difference was used to justify neglect or the suppression of commercial farming. The colonial idea was that natives should focus on subsistence and food production and leave global market production to the plantations. Okay, so that's this sort of smallholder scale. Now I want to switch more briefly to focus more on the plantations themselves, what one might think of as capitalism from above, or what I'm calling dead plantations. So large-scale plantations have been present in Indonesia since 1870, and the colonial land law that enables the granting of land concessions is still effectively in place. So this is one meaning one could give to the idea of a plantationocene, a land law passed in 1870 to permit the granting of plantation concessions to foreign companies, survived through the period of independence, the new constitution, the 1960 land law, and is still fundamentally in place. So Indonesia is a country where customary land rights are barely recognized and where the government continues to give out massive corporate land concessions, as we saw from the red areas on the map. So it's a colonial land law still in force, which enables all that red to emerge across the map. Although usually labeled capitalist, one could argue that these large-scale plantations are not characterized by free markets or by competition. Unlike small-scale commodity producers, plantation corporations usually do not pay market prices for land or labor, which they secure forcefully with state backing. They don't pay the market price for capital either, as they are subsidized by cheap credit. In Indonesia, plantation corporations typically pay little or no taxes. They may be supplied with government-organized cheap labor and government-constructed infrastructure. Laws are written to favor them, and laws that are supposed to hold them accountable are not enforced. So these practices of corporate subsidy and support for plantations are centuries old and have been routine in the Americas, in Asia and Africa from colonial times to today. The contemporary rationale for corporate subsidies and bailouts is that plantations are needed to provide jobs and bring development to remote areas. Pro-plantation policies also hinge on an expectation of productive efficiency, which is conjured by the plantation as an iconic site of modernity in what's assumed to be empty or underutilized frontier land. So if you remember from the pictures, like a flattened landscape in which everything has been cut down or a big mill has been constructed, it's performing. We are the modern, we are the rational, we are the efficient, we are the ones bringing productivity and development to remote areas. And they are also, I want to use Dale's beautiful phrase, about sort of difference within. At the same time as they are performing modernity, they are also insisting on the backwardness of the customary landholders. Because if the customary landholders were doing anything useful or productive, the plantations would not be there, right? So the very presence of the plantation is the performance of the lazy native. But are plantations actually efficient? No doubt there's some variation, but there's also much room for doubt. Why the need for subsidies and bailouts? Why can't corporations pay their own costs of production, including infrastructure? Why can't they pay their fair share of taxes? In the research I conducted with my colleague, Pujo Sumadi, on oil palm plantations in Indonesia, we found the plantations to be corrupt, leaky machines that actually produce less per hectare than the more efficient smallholders, and at much higher cost per unit because of the need to pay for managers, accountants, overseers, and guards. The so-called inverse relation, in which smaller farms are more productive per hectare than larger ones, applies with oil palm as with many other plantation crops. There are, in fact, no technical economies of scale in plantation production of oil palm. And the techniques used to grow the palm on small holdings and on plantations are identical. So it's not actually a more modern or technical or efficient form of production, it's just bigger and flatter. The tools used are also very basic. Harvesting on these massive plantations is still done by a skilled man wielding a sharp knife attached to a very long stick. This technology has not changed in 100 years because plantation labor, which is politically provided, one could say, at a cheap cost, is so very cheap that the plantation corporations have no incentive to innovate technically at all. So to summarize, these then are some of the insights on capitalism we can draw from the concept of a plantationercy and the world that plantations make. First of all, one could argue, of course, depending on one's definition of capitalism, that plantations are not capitalist. By that we mean competition, efficiency, and the compulsion to produce at the market rate. They don't do these things, they're subsidized, they're bailed out, and they're able to survive despite their catastrophic production failures. This, of course, is common in lots of corporations, right? It's not actually just plantations, but many corporations are kept alive by subsidies. And so the idea that, a large modern corporation is a capitalist enterprise is one that always requires some scrutiny. That's the first point. The second point is that the plantation formation is not a point on a transition path. Plantations are not the products of capital accumulation and investment, as one might imagine from the transition narrative. Plantations, you could say, are born big. They're politically induced and they're protected, right? They're not the product of gradual accumulation and getting smarter and getting bigger and getting, more efficient and more technological. They're none of those things. They start big. mowing down the land and planting what is in fact very archaic technology. Also, plantations are not dynamic. Compared with the smallholders that I described, the plantation format is actually fantastically static. It produces more and more of the same. Same crop, same technology, same organizational schema, same layout. The way plantations were organized 100 years ago in Indonesia in the 1870s is almost identical to how they are organized now. And I think Dale has also reflected this, right? Some of the stickiness of the plantation format is a plantation from 500 years ago is recognizable in terms of a plantation today. So there's something which is not at all dynamic and transformational here, but actually replication of a plantation format which continues with remarkably little change. Finally, I've emphasized that plantations are founded on and endlessly replicate a racialized colonial narrative, the myth of the lazy native. Without this foundational myth, there would be no need for plantation presence. So I want to move now, having talked about these two different formats and how we might or might not characterize them as capitalist, to recognize that both the smallholder format that I've described and the plantations are producing global market crops. So they are producing crops which are fed into global markets and globalized prices. They do so, though, in very different ways and with very different consequences for the agrarian relations and rural development. So my main orientation is actually not to try to understand the global capitalist system or the world economy, as some of my colleagues on this panel, but as an anthropologist and someone who works in the field of development, I'm really trying to figure out what difference does it make. Like if you're producing coffee or cocoa or rubber in the smallholder model or on a plantation, these are in fact entirely different experiences of development and rural life. They're not at all equivalent on the ground. So for this reason, to cast a critical scrutiny on who are these dynamic, productive smallholders who can do such amazing things with basically no support, and what are these large plantations which take up a third of the agricultural land and have been granted concessions which will last 100 years. So this is a permanent transformation of the rural landscape. So we have these two competing forms, and I think it's important to scrutinize both of them and also to understand how one relates to the other. Globally, one can say everywhere today, including in Brazil, of course, corporations are being granted access to land on a massive scale and subsidies based on the argument that they produce efficiently and bring development and jobs to remote areas. The World Bank carried out a study some years ago, which produced maps of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, showing what it called the yield gap, the gap between what farmers are currently producing on all of this land and the potential yield under efficient management. So what did the bank conclude from this study? It basically concluded that half of the world's potential farmland is unused, or in their terms, underutilized. In short, the world is still full of lazy natives. Hence, the colonial project of displacing them by plantations and large farms needs to be completed. Jobs and development will result, right? This is the argument of the World Bank, surveying global agricultural production and concluding that half of the potential farmland in the world is either unused or underutilized. So it should be taken from the lazy natives who for so many centuries have failed to do anything useful with it and granted to corporations that can get the job done. So this is a globally circulating argument, which has, of course, massive implications. Yet, I would argue that corporations and their supporters, in fact, supply no evidence that jobs and development are actually the result from this form of investment. Rather, corporate agriculture takes up space and smallholder production is suppressed and squeezed out. In Indonesia, the problem is especially acute because, as I showed on the map of all that red, multiple plantations occupy entire zones, which are not only vast spatially, but entrenched legally and permanently. So this is a model with massive and permanent transformational effects. What is the alternative? As I've argued, smallholders in Southeast Asia and elsewhere have an excellent track record of producing commodities whenever market opportunities beckon. Some dedicate all their land to a single crop, so one can't necessarily assume that because they are peasants or smallholders, they will favor food production or ecological balance. Maybe yes, maybe no. If the market opportunities are beckoning, they may very well also put all their land under the single crop. So if they have enough land, they will have a more mixed kind of farming than one sees in that kind of flattened plantation agriculture. But nevertheless, one cannot assume that they will balance food and cash crop production. That's a convenient myth, but not really borne out. Nevertheless, the distributed profile of small-scale smallholder commodity production is much better than that of the corporate form. In the zone that we studied, smallholders producing oil palm paid their workers twice the daily wage of the plantations. It's true that not all people were successful in growing oil palm. Some became landless. It is true that where smallholders are subject to capitalist discipline, class formation among them will follow. Nevertheless, landless villagers also prospered by working for their neighbors and the diverse small enterprises that arise where there's money around. So smallholders who are doing well with oil palm, cocoa, coffee, or anything else, they spend their money locally. They fix up their houses, they buy a new motorbike, there's suddenly opportunity for a small restaurant or a food stall. So even those who are not successful in the main cash crop production will also prosper if there is local prosperity. In contrast, a plantation zone is a dead zone. So I showed you the village perched on the edge of the river, destitute. No farmland, no money, no guarantee of plantation jobs either. Plantation corporations spend their money globally. Plantation workers are mainly migrants. They send their money elsewhere. Nothing happens locally. This is a fact which has been observed in the Caribbean also by George Beckford and others. It's very well known that plantation zones are, economically speaking, dead zones. Nevertheless, look at all that red on the map, right? That is the form which is effectively being replicated. So the implications then for advocacy, for how one might change this scenario, in Indonesia, I would, which is the place I know, advocacy agendas that promote agroecological farming and especially food sovereignty among peasant or indigenous farmers struggle to find a constituency, because these platforms are based on the idea of the subsistence-oriented peasant. Right? These social movements are actually quite hostile or even allergic to small-scale farmers who jump with both feet into commodity production, like the cocoa farmers that I described. So Indonesian farmers who repeatedly show enthusiasm for commercial crop production actually get no support from social movements whose image and whose desire is to find, if not lazy natives, then certainly subsistence-oriented, sustainability-loving, nature-loving, forest-respecting kinds of natives. And if instead they find enthusiastic cash crop production producers, they don't love them and they don't really support them. So here we have a kind of a gap between an advocacy agenda, which desires to work with a certain kind of subject, and the actual history of Southeast Asia's small-scale producers who have been enthusiastic cash crop producers for several hundred years. They find themselves without any support. So one of the kind of unfortunate side effects of this mismatch between advocacy and the facts on the ground or the local inclination is that the plantations face no effective opposition at all. Therefore, the red zone continues to expand, and the smallholder producers continue to be very exposed and lacking any support. So this is, I guess one could say, a suggestion that by thinking more deeply and more critically about how different kinds of production regime, smallholders versus plantations. Among smallholders, also I've suggested some are fully market committed, some are more opportunistic, take advantage of a boom, drift away when the boom ends. But either way, these are very, very different forms of production, and really neither of them, I'm arguing, fit with the transition narrative that we have inherited, right? Neither the cash crop producing smallholders, which emerged 300 years ago and are still enthusiastically doing their thing, or the plantation format, which also emerged hundreds of years ago and is still statically replicating and doing the same thing. Neither of these really fit with a transition scenario in which we're moving from one form of production to another in a linear fashion. So that, I think, is a contribution one could have to theorizing from Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Well, Tanya, I was sure, but now I'm pretty sure that I was right when I put you and Dale together, because you did do a well job putting together these two presentations. It's very rare to have the opportunity to hear twice in a row about the making and the reconfiguring of large scale cash crop production. Its ideological justification and its social context. Thank you so much. And now I'm honored to introduce Professor Massimiliano Tomba from the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Professor Tomba, coming from a background in critical theory and political philosophy, has been actively studying the notions of space and time in order to find in them meaning beyond the normative, ideological, and violent framework imposed by capitalism and conceptualized in modernization theories. You will find this all in Tomba's prize-winning book, Insurgent Universality, An Alternative Legacy of Modernity, which came out in 2019. His work has also been published not only in English, but also in German and Italian. Thank you, Professor Tomba, for your presence, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? No. I turned it off.
Let me fix. No, we take it and it stops working.
Oh, there it is. Okay, let's try it again. Yes. Okay. So, thank you so much for inviting me. And as Dale Tomich said at the beginning of his presentation, there is an ongoing dialogue, conversation between Dale, Francis, and myself. And the question is, when you put together historians and philosophers, what is the kind of a conversation that can take place? And I think my notes today, maybe they will sound a little bit too theoretical. I hope not abstract, but I think this is a kind of a result of a conversation between historians and philosophers and theorists. So basically, is my attempt to question some of the categories, concepts that we always use when we do history. Time, historical time, temporalization, modernity, modernizations, and so on, and all these categories. They work, I would say, on our back, and unconsciously we always use it. So when Tanya sent me the title of the panel, I asked myself, what does it mean to read history and capitalism and capitalist modernity a contrapelo do capital, against the grain, against the grain of capital, the state, and their histories. And then this expression against the grain, a contrapelo, invited me to make a link between the title of the panel and Walter Benjamin, who is a philosopher that I love. And in his thesis number 7, Thesis on History, Benjamin writes, it's a short citation, don't worry. He writes, there is no document of a civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism characterizes also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. A historical materialist, therefore, dissociates himself from it as far as possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain. So, the question again is, what does it mean to brush history against the grain? What does it mean to question the categories that we use when we do history? When we talk about modernity and non-modern forms of social forms and so on. Benjamin, I don't go there. Benjamin, in order to address this question, when he tried to answer this question, he used theological categories. He went into theology. I'm not doing that. But I think it's an interesting move. So why did he need to go into theology in order to question modern categories? I'm not doing that. Don't worry. So my thesis is basically that what we call modernity is the product, is the result of specific forms of temporalization. I will explain the meaning of this term in a second. And these temporalization or temporalizations, plural, are not just abstract or pieces of theories. They are real, they are concrete, they are economic, political, and legal processes. And I think if we assume that there are coexisting temporalizations, we also need to assume that we have to investigate these different temporalities and the temporalizations on the concrete battlefield of historical events. When something concrete happens, real conflicts, basically. And I think reading history against the grain means to give a priority to this battlefield, to this conflict. So, in my opinion, this is my personal perspective, we can understand history when real conflicts happen, within the conflict, within the tension that is generated when different temporalities are in friction with each other. I will explain also this point. I hope so. So, first question, what is modernity in relation to time and temporalization? One can say modernity is basic definitions, and we have to question all of them. Modernity is the epoch that creates epochs. Modernity is the epoch of periodization, pre-modern, pre-capitalist, pre-estate. All these categories are created, invented by modernity. Modernity is let's assume that the modernity is a question mark, and we have to find some definition. Modernity is a gigantic device of a periodization. Modernity, second definition, is a form of space-temporal self-representation. What does it mean? Or geographical temporal self-representation. It means that the dominant self-representation of historical time in modernity is a kind of a unilinear arrow, temporal arrow. This is the idea of time that is generated in modernity, and that became dominant. But the interesting thing is that the West, Europe maybe, I think even Europe has to be questioned. But in any case, the West placed itself at the tip of the arrow. What is the implication of that? If historical time is a line, obviously, other forms which are just different from the West, they can only appear as backwards, residuals, something that belongs to the past, something that has to be modernized. So in a certain way, through this self-representation of modernity, colonization is a gift. Is the way the West helps others to become modern. It's a form of justification, self-legitimization of colonialism. It works. It works. Theoretically, it works. The point is that it works theoretically and ideologically, but since it is grounded in our categories, very often we use the same colonial representation even when we question colonialism. This is one of my points. So if we want to question colonialism, we have to be serious. And we have to question the categories through which colonialism works. Modernity also, and this is a kind of a difficult point, I have to speed up a little bit. Modernity also shapes the past by transforming the past or turning the past into historical stages. So like the train stations in the railway. And this way of shaping the past is possible through conceptualization. In one word, concepts, modern concepts, are also device of a temporalization. This is how the historical past has been temporalized by conceptualizing the past. This is tricky because, then they say, okay, Max, what is your solution? Should we give up on concepts? Yes and no. I think we should play at the edge of this. So concepts are modern concepts, are Western concepts, and they are also devices of temporalization. But if what I say is true, concepts are also devices of colonization. And as my colleague said before, another concept produced by conceptualization of the past is the concept of a transition. Maybe we should abandon the concept of a transition and start reading history in a different way, in which temporalities and temporalizations coexist in a kind of a conflict or battlefield. So, in order, Yeah, I will not finish. It's not.
Do
We'll
Go
see.
for it.
Yeah, we'll see. So, I think I have to start with a polemical note, and obviously the target is a giant in history and historiography, and it was mentioned already by Dale Tomich. The giant is Reinhard Koselleck, one of the founders of the so-called conceptual history, the Begriffsgeschichte. So Koselleck used a painting by Albrecht Altdorfer. I have the painting in my PowerPoint. I think it's just Google, Altdorfer, and the title of the painting is The Battle of Alexander. This painting was painted in 1529. Okay, keep in mind the date for a moment. Okay, 1529. This is this painting, and the painting represents the Battle of Issus, which occurred in 333 BC. Okay, it's the past. Altdorfer, this is what Koselleck told us, and it's accurate. He's a good historian. So Altdorfer took information from Curtius Rufus, and he tried to represent these battles with the exact number of combatants, dead, prisoners on both sides. So the number of the soldiers is kind of accurate. Now the tricky thing, there are two tricky things. The first one is all these groups, the warriors, the prisoners, the dead, and so on, they are simultaneously present in the painting, as if time was frozen. And the entire battle could be represented like in one picture. And Reinhard Koselleck said that was a kind of an interesting anachronism. So Altdorfer, according to Koselleck, made conscious use of an anachronism by representing the course of the entire battle in one scene, in one representation. But this is not the most interesting anachronism. Now we are moving toward interesting things. Koselleck says there is another anachronism. Let's call it anachronism 2. The anachronism 2 is this: the Battle of Issus, in which Persians are represented as Turks, evokes the Ottoman Empire's first attempt to capture Vienna in the same year as the painting was painted. Okay? So this is what Altdorfer did. And to do this, Koselleck juxtaposes, in order to call it anachronism, Koselleck juxtaposes Altdorfer's experience of historical time with that of Friedrich Schlegel in the 19th century. So, I want to make the story very short. When Schlegel saw the same picture, he said, oh, this is an interesting anachronism. The Persians are represented as Turks. Altdorfer is playing with a battle that was taking place in his own time. It was not working as an historian. Schlegel. Koselleck says, and I think he's right, Altdorfer didn't have the sense of that anachronism. Okay? Let's move on. So, in Koselleck, implication is that what is the difference between Schlegel, 19th century, and Altdorfer, 16th century? The difference is that in these 300 years, almost 300 years, what occurred was the temporalization of history. Here, the magic word. Temporalization of history. In other terms, Altdorfer in the 16th century didn't have a sense of anachronism. Why? Because he was not able to, he couldn't temporalize history. There was a lack of a sense of the past, a lack of a temporalization, as if temporalization is only a modern thing. Only we modern are able to temporalize historical time. This is Koselleck's assumption. I argue that what appears as anachronism or confusion of historical time in Middle Ages or in Altdorfer must be understood instead, not in terms of a lack of a temporalization, but as a different criteria of the temporalization of time. So my point is time can be temporalized in different ways. A very short philological note. It's true that the term anachronism appeared in Europe only in the 17th century. And the meaning of anachronism was a kind of a mistake in the course of a synchronism. The word synchronism only appeared for the first time in 1588. So Koselleck is right and wrong at the same time. There is a new sense of the past, history, a temporalization that begins with the modernity, and then we have the sense of a synchronism and anachronism, is wrong at the same time. Why? Because it assumes a lack of a temporalization in Middle Ages or in other historical cultural contexts. So he assumes that the temporalization is only a modern Western thing. My point is that there is not only, and now we are going to the real stuff. There is not only one way of thinking of temporalization, but there are many ways we think we can experience temporalization. So for that reason, against Koselleck, if you like, we have to assume temporalizations plural. And these different temporalizations kind of coexist in the same present. I needed to cut something because yeah, I think I can do it. So I think it's possible to put it schematically. It's possible to say that what we call historical time can be temporalized from the past, from the future, from the present, and even Middle Ages, from eternity. And then we have already 4 different forms of temporalizations. Like I said, this is very abstract, doesn't make any sense. No, it's very concrete and very real. What is a temporalization from the future? This is very modern. This is the idea of a progress. This is Condorcet. This is the French Revolution. This is temporalization from the future. The present makes sense because we are going somewhere else. That is the future, and the future gives sense to the present and the past. What is a temporalization from the present, from the point of view of the present? Philosophically, is Hegel. Historically is historicism. So basically, what is the past? The past is the way we become what we are. And we can represent the entire past as a long trajectory that leads to us, to what we are. Hegel added something more interesting, and he said, oh, and from the point of view of the present, every single stage of the past was necessary. Why? Because we are the result. So temporalization from the present is also possible and has been used. Temporalization from the perspective of eternity, this is even more interesting, and that was a common in Middle Ages, and that was a common in early Christianity. I give you just an example. We can go there, but so an example is Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine has this reflection on time, and his point is that when we only experience time in terms of past, present, and future, Augustine said we feel confused. We feel without a compass. We feel without an orientation in time. He says in these terms we are fragmented and dispersed in time. When I say now, the now is already past, and so on. We are fragmented in time. And then he introduces this other dimension that he calls intensio, and that is the vertical, is the transcendence, is eternity. Eternity gives sense and orientation to time and the present. This is not just a theory. That was the sense of time in Middle Ages. For that reason, in Middle Ages, let's be very concrete. In Middle Ages, forms of resistance to the tyrant were possible because of this different temporal framework. For they called the resistance to the tyrant restoration of the right order that the tyrant violates. What is the right order? Is the order that transcends the existing order. So the temporality of the transcendence gives space to many things, to change the existing order, to resist against the tyrant, and to make basically our political social present much more unstable. So the myth that the Middle Ages is static and without changes, this is a myth. This is a modern myth. Because modernity wants to monopolize changes and modification and revolution. Middle Ages was I would say, was even more dynamic than what we call modernity. Questionable, but I can defend it. Okay, I want to give you a couple of examples, much more concrete. Okay, maybe it was a kind of abstract so far. 2 examples. So, as I say, the medieval image of historical time, it is as if the world were stretched vertically. And from here, from this vertical hierarchy, it was given order. When the earthly order and its hierarchies are shaken, the backlash is felt on the vertical divine temporality. This is the reason why, historically, uprisings, jacquerie, riots, intertwined with the proliferation of heretical movements. So religion and politics were intertwined for this reason, because a kind of an earthquake on the line of a time was also an earthquake on the line of the vertical, of the transcendence. Okay, this is what again, schematically, this is basically what happened in the so-called early modernity. Now, if we assume the unilinear narrative, we have to find at a certain point a transition from this medieval conception of time to the modern conception of time. This is what I question. There is no transition. And I give you an example. I give you a couple of examples. So the first example, I have 3 minutes. So the first example,
That's fine.
okay. The first example goes back to my country, Italy. And we are in the 16th century, beginning of the 16th century. And we're talking about Machiavelli. You know Machiavelli. Machiavelli, at that time, needed new categories to understand and intervene in a present that was undergoing transformation. In one of these texts, the Discourses on Living, Machiavelli comments on Polybion, the succession of the form of a government. But when he comments and he copied and he translated Polybion, he made a crucial epistemological transformation. And this is the line. So Polybion was talking about the succession of these forms of a government which followed a circular sequence, a kind of a necessity, from one to another, to another, to another. Machiavelli copied this line and he changed it a little bit, and he wrote, "This variation of government arise by chance among men." By chance. In Italian is a caso, randomly. So he introduced chance against necessity. What he's doing is opening up necessity, if you want. This is not Machiavelli's language, what we can call transition, to a kind of an open field of possibilities in which different chances are given. And basically, you, the historian and the politicians, you are in that battlefield and you play with these possibilities, with the chance. And by introducing the chance, Machiavelli breaks the chain of necessity and reads historical events in terms of changes, in Italian, mutazioni, and therefore in terms of innovative outcomes. This is what Machiavelli is doing. So basically, it's creating a kind of a battlefield in the present. He opened up the present to many chances and changes. And he could see the productivity of a conflict. There is an alternative at the same time. So this is the simultaneity of different temporalization. This is a piece of intellectual history, okay? But we can do the same thing with the real history. So this is still a piece of intellectual history. At the same time, another Italian, whose name was Guicciardini, he was addressing the same problem. But for Guicciardini, the issue was to give a stability to the present. And his solution was to try to ground the stability of the government on the wisdom, authority, a continuity of experience of the aristocrats. Then you have a Guicciardini and you have a continuity. It's a kind of a temporalization from the point of view of the present, how to preserve the stability of the present, and how to preserve the continuity. Machiavelli was working with a possible break between the past and the present. Another example, third person. At the same time, they were all of them in Florence. The third guy is Savonarola. Savonarola tried to Girolamo Savonarola tried to restore the liberty. This is a citation: liberty and the communal property, which were continuously violated by government, and thereby causing the people to be malcontent and restless. Guicciardini was playing with another temporalization of time that is a kind of a restorative temporality. He was trying to restore early Christianity in the 16th century. That means he was trying to return to the forms of common possession and government of the equality of the early Christians. But don't misunderstand, this is not Romanticism and is not naive. It was not trying to go back. It was trying to reactivate the energy of that past in order to change the present. Okay, what you get now is three different strategies of temporalization: break, continuity, and restoration. These three different strategies of temporalization of the present and the historical material, which Machiavelli is reading Polybius, Savonarola is reading the Gospels, and Guicciardini is reading Polybius well and reading the history of Italy in order to find the continuity. So it's what I'm saying, we are dealing with both a theoretical, intellectual way of temporalization. How do they write books, the books that we read? And we are also dealing with the real uprisings. At that time, there were real uprisings. There were social, what of today we call social mobilizations. They attempt to restore the early Christian community. Was not a dream in the head of a Savonarola, was a real thing. All over around Europe, from North Italy to South Germany, there were wars, the so-called peasant wars. And these peasants were massacred, killed in the fight. But they were doing what? They were trying to restore a different, let's use a different term, a different way of living, a different way of being together, a different way of practicing equality, a different legal system. This is the tension. So basically what we can see at the time is a tension between different legal systems, different temporalities, and what we can do as historians is try to work with that tension, with the gap between these temporalities, and maybe we can even do something more. We can do what the Machiavelli tried to do, and keep this gap open in order to think chance and changes and possibilities. Possibilities which are not given in the progress or in the romantic past, but in the tension of the present. I think this is how history can become political. And this is what Benjamin had in mind, or this is how I read Benjamin. How history can become, or can be, or is political. I'll give you another example, and then I stop, even if I have something else. Something similar happened in this is more concrete. This is something maybe it's even more familiar to you, but just a piece of Italian intellectual history. So this is something that took place in the Asian Revolution. We know the Asian Revolution. So, and then we have the story is a little bit more complex, but let's simplify a little bit. During the Asian Revolution, we have the main dominant trajectory, let's say Toussaint Louverture, and his attempt to restore the functioning of the plantation system, we were talking about that, imposed on Haiti a kind of accelerated course of modernization based on labor, large-scale production, large-scale plantation production, and a legal system that basically he borrowed from the French Revolution. The 1801 Constitution, written by Toussaint Louverture, basically mirrors the French Constitution and the French Declaration, written in 1795. You take the two texts, put them together on your desk, and you can see. So it was just mirroring the dominant trajectory of the French Revolution. Then you say, okay, where is the tension then? Where is the gap? Within the same Haitian Revolution, there were bossal communities. We are not familiar with that. The bossal communities were what? First generation slaves, Africans, and they were half of the population, half of the colony population in Haiti. During the revolution, the bossal communities put into practice or tried to restore different modes of production, forms of self-regulation, and a kind of egalitarian peasant system, different legalities. That is the tension. Toussaint Louverture tried to synchronize the nation state of Haiti to the course of the European statehood through an enormous, a gigantic concentration of power. Power that was placed in the hands of the government. He defended modern individual private property. It's written, it's in the Constitution, in the 1801 Constitution. And that article is verbatim the same article you can find in the French Declaration of the 1795. So basically, the synchronization of the state that Toussaint Louverture was putting in place was not only going in the same direction of the French Revolution and the European modern state, but was basically violently synchronizing the other legality and legal system practiced by the bossal communities. So the bossal trajectory, local community, system of counter plantations, was basically destroyed by the dominant temporality represented by the process of building a new modern state, a new legal system, a new form of production based on plantation. So again, the game I'm playing is not an opposition between A and B, Toussaint and bossal, and the bossal communities. What I want to point out is there was a tension, there was a friction between different temporalities, different trajectories, different way of a temporalization. And this tension is exactly the place where a different politics can emerge, a different way of imagining the present can emerge. I think this is my conclusion. I think this is the way today history can still teach us something about the present and the possibilities to change our present. Again, this is a statement against Koselleck, who thinks that history is no longer, by citing Cicero, magistra vitae. It's no longer something that teaches us how to act in the present. I think history can still teach us how to act in the present, but we need an entirely different understanding of history and historical time. And we need to focus on these histories against the grain, which emerge in all these tensions and these conflicts. That's it. There is something more, but I think I ran out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max, for your talk. I think we've just had the opportunity to hear 3 brilliant talks about many things. I see many things coming across your presentations that I could comment on. For sure, the normative temporality of capital, that's going beneath your 3 talks. The self-representation of capitalism, the market, social relations, and how they're related to each other. But I'm going to open up the session for questions, so the audience can raise questions for you guys, and then we can talk for a while. We started almost 15 minutes later. We are supposed to go until 5, but I think 10 past 5 is fine. So we're going to have 40 minutes, more or less, for discussion. Great. The first question that we have is from Rogério. By the way, Max, I wrote the letter to you about reading Capitalism Against the Grain, but I'm the one who has his own labor exploited by other people. I was just writing the letter. The guys who made the questions were those that you met. You were on his boat trip yesterday, and everybody there. The guys were here, Daniel, Douglas, Rogério, Juliana, Cedric Castillo, Cristi, Marcos Enoni, Alessandra, all this group. These are the bad guys. I was just writing the letter to you. Rogério, please.
Okay. So we have 2 icons.
Vou falar em português para vocês traduzirem, tem problema?
Tudo bem, Rafael? Rogério falando português?
Tânia, eu queria fazer uma pergunta para ti, depois para o Massimiliano. 2 questões surgiram.
Just a moment. Rafael,
Coloca para o Dale.
is it possible to put Dale on there? É possível colocar o Dale lá?
Já botou. Vou virar aqui. A primeira questão...
Peraí, só um minutinho. Ele vai arrumar o som.
A primeira questão que surge da sua apresentação para mim é a universalidade do modelo capitalista de exploração da terra e da produção agrícola, e como no Brasil esta é uma questão absolutamente atual e politizada e política, na medida em que aqui também nós temos esses 2 polos que estão em oposição. Por um lado, o que nós chamamos aqui de agronegócio, que é exatamente as plantations, que se desenvolve no oeste do Brasil, largas plantações de soja, financiadas por bancos e maquinário industrializado, exploração do trabalhador. E, por outro lado, a gente tem também um processo relativamente recente de ebulição organizada das pequenas propriedades e da plantação comunitária que são organizadas pelo movimento dos trabalhadores rurais sem terra, né? E que hoje começa a despontar como um grande e prolífico produtor alimentício para a população brasileira. E, obviamente, essa oposição de modelos, ela transcende para a questão cultural. E essa é uma pergunta que eu gostaria de fazer para você, na medida em que aqui existe uma qualificação positiva estimulada de forma artificial pelos meios de comunicação acerca dessa cultura que aqui nós chamamos de cultura do sertanejo, né? Um conjunto de atividades culturais, especialmente musicais, que olham para o campo de forma individualizadora, produzindo, né, uma utopia do homem do campo e que serve exatamente para manter as coisas como estão nas plantations, nas grandes plantações. Eu queria saber se esse tipo de movimento, vamos dizer assim, cultural, artificial, ele acontece também na Indonésia. E como é que você vê essa oposição no Brasil, se é que você tem alguma questão relativa a isso? E outra questão também, Tânia, que a sua palestra me chamou a atenção muito, né? É que essa narrativa positiva das plantations, né, do capitalismo, é uma espécie de uma revivência ou de um capitalismo que está aprisionado numa versão etílica e, de alguma forma, artificialmente progressista do positivismo da segunda metade do século XIX, né? Então, Augusto Comte aparece para mim aqui como ainda um modelo teórico sociológico que dá justificação, que legitima o desenvolvimento de um modelo de capitalismo completamente anacrônico, né? E é um modelo que se perpetua exatamente porque, neste momento histórico, segunda metade do século XIX, o capitalismo encontra exatamente o seu momento de maior afirmação, seja histórica, seja política, seja econômica, né? Mas principalmente uma afirmação de narrativa. Ou seja, o capitalismo ele se realiza na prática de forma incompetente, mas ele produz um discurso de extrema capacidade e de superioridade que lhe permite produzir exatamente a colonização e a violência, né? Queria saber o que você acha dessa questão. E Marx, então, várias questões também para o Marx, então vou fazer uma rápida só para não deixar de falar. É muito bom ouvir um professor de filosofia fazer uma crítica, pelo menos uma crítica lateral, ao Koselleck, né? Porque o Koselleck ele tem questões, obviamente, de natureza epistemológica, né? Na sua relação com Hegel, né? Especialmente a leitura que ele faz da relação entre passado e futuro, a partir de Hegel, né? Espaço de experiência, horizonte de expectativa, né? Mas também existem questões políticas muito importantes, dado que o Koselleck sempre se assumiu como um continuador das teses, inclusive historiográficas, do Carl Schmitt. Eu queria que você conversasse um pouco com a gente sobre isso. Muito obrigado.
So we still have more questions. The next one is Gustavo. But Gustavo, since Rogério made 3, I think we should give them time to talk. Or you think that your question connects with his? No? Okay. So let's go for Rogério's questions first. All right? Could you go first?
Sure, thank you. I cannot speak to this Brazilian history. I'm sorry. that I don't know, enough about how this plantation format may have morphed in terms of, a site of the most horrendous violence and exploitation to become one of, you're suggesting, kind of cultural revival, kind of idyllic, modern, perhaps. What I can say is that, speaking from what I know in terms of Indonesia, this kind of within the stable spatial and administrative arrangements of the plantation, which I argued have been very stable over hundreds of years, the kinds of labor regime within, whether it depended on forced and captured labor, I mean, these elements have changed historically. So during the colonial period in Indonesia, plantation workers were indentured, not enslaved as such, but bound by a contract, which meant they could not leave the plantation. So plantations were understood as sites of unfreedom, exploitation, being beaten, this kind of violence. After, plantations were then nationalized in the 1950s, and in the 60s and 70s, these nationalized state plantations were in fact developed as icons of modernity, kind of like the factory city, Fordlandia, and so on, right? So labor conditions, it became an aristocracy of labor. To be a plantation worker was to have a stable job, the same as being a government official. You had a steady salary, you had a pension, you had a house, education for your children, childcare, etc. So they turned from being the most despised kinds of work and the most captured and punished workers to being a privileged labor aristocracy. The government argues that plantations today are necessary because they provide jobs, good jobs. This is the narrative. But in fact, it has changed again, because in a period of national and perhaps even global labor surplus, plantations now do not try to capture and hold workers, they expel them. So work is outsourced and casualized. Very few people have stable, well-paid plantation jobs. Most people have short-term contracts, and the labor law has been redesigned to permit this kind of casualization and outsourcing. So the labor deterioration of labor conditions that we've seen globally also applies to the plantation. So what this is saying is that at the same time as there's these different labor processes, the position of the plantation in the national imaginary, like is it the site of modernity, hope, progress? Is it a site of fierce and violent exploitation, or is it some sort of entrepreneurial space where you might earn a little bit of money for a while without any security? All of these changes have happened within the same basic physical structure and hierarchical administrative structure of the plantation, which is stable. So that's all I can say. How this is played out in Brazilian space, I can't speak to that.
Thank you. Just for a comment on Rogério question, the right-wing ideology in Brazil has also an aesthetic project.
Yeah.
And this aesthetic project goes through this country music related to agribusiness security in Brazil. Max?
Portuguese or English, man?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
As my son is 4 years old, and he uses the term tomorrow for indefinite future. And yesterday is it's the past. It can be 1 month. So tomorrow. Yeah, on Kozelek, I think a very short question, very short answer. So I think a lot depends on the way we understand the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous, and usually this statement is attributed to Kozelek, but actually Kozelek borrowed this statement. At least there are two other thinkers, and I think Kozelek read both of them. So he, not in the 50s, obviously, or in the 60s, but in the 70s, he cited Hans Meyer, if I remember correctly, who used the term, and he was not a nice person to cite, to quote, because he was an activist, a national socialist, and he used the term, and he used this idea of multiple historical times. And the other guy was not, Kozelek didn't cite the other person who used the term contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous for opposite reason, because the other thinker, philosopher, was Ernst Bloch, who was a communist. So Kozelek didn't want to quote a Nazi or a communist, and basically he just appropriated the statement without citing anybody. Now the point is, what do we do with this statement, with the contemporaneity of the non-contemporary? This is the thing. What do we do with this? And I think Kozelek did something interesting. He pluralized historical times. He started talking in terms of layers of times. Excellent. I think where we can go after Kozelek, and I would say beyond the Kozelek, is try to think in terms of friction and tension between these historical layers or temporalities. What is the gap between these temporalities? What is the tension and the conflict generated by these different temporalities? And then, what is the possibility? What is the field of possibilities or chances, by using Machiavelli's term, that can be generated in this conflict? If you want, is basically nothing more and maybe just a little bit. But in any case, it's what two thinkers, both very political. One is Karl Marx, the name is famous, and the other one is Mariátegui. Both understood when they are talking on the Russian commune, they understood the Russian commune not as an institution that belongs to the past, but as an opportunity to skip capitalist accumulation. So they understood that this anachronism is actually full of possibilities if we play the anachronism in tension with the present. That tension can generate something else. I think this is another tradition, another way to go, and this other way to go leads beyond the Kozelek, because the Kozelek didn't see the tension and the conflict. I think he didn't see because he didn't want to see the tension. Because, between us, he was a conservative. This guy was a real conservative historian, super smart, but he was a conservative.
Thank you so much, Max. Thank you, Tanya. So, Gustavo, please.
I think I need to speak in English, otherwise they won't understand, right? Because he has no translation of
true.
it.
Yeah, they are translating to Portuguese, but they all can understand Portuguese.
Oh, okay.
So it's to you. But if you want to go directly in English, go directly in English. He's gonna listen.
Yeah,
Go directly in
Tem
English.
mais gente aqui que fala português do que inglês. Então, eu vou falar na minha língua.
Ok, tô falando a sua língua. Rafael, a gente vai precisar da tradução pro Dale, tá? Tradução pro Dale.
O Dale,
Ok.
o Max, if I may, você entende português?
I try, otherwise I ask Travis
Ok.
for a little
Tá bom.
help.
Então, eu tenho algumas questões para a Tânia, e alguns mais comentários para o Max. Tânia, o Marx já tinha, famoso, como você disse, já tinha chamado a atenção para as forças de centralização e descentralização do movimento do capital. Então, a presença de uma grande unidade de produção junto a uma pluralidade de pequenas não é estranha na história do capital, nem na indústria, não apenas no mundo rural. Eu fico me perguntando, você, correct me if I'm wrong, que você colocou mais ênfase na circulação e em certos aspectos das diferenças entre os camponeses e a plantation. E eu me pergunto se você tivesse enfocado mais nas relações de produção, se você não teria chegado a outra conclusão. Porque depois, adiante na sua fala, você começa a falar de small farmers em lugar de peasants. E nós sabemos que as duas coisas são diferentes. Talvez realmente esses peasants são small farmers. Não é? Então, eu não sei se eu entendi bem, mas eu queria te ouvir sobre isso. Max, eu sou antropólogo. Os antropólogos leem l'année sociologique de uma forma muito direcionada para a antropologia. Então, o Émile Durkheim escreveu um livro chamado As Formas Elementares da Vida Religiosa, que é muito lido na antropologia, onde ele coloca claramente a existência de diferentes concepções de tempo vinculadas às diferentes formas de organização social. No fundo, é isso que está em jogo ali. Né? E, bom, ou seja, descobrir que existem diferentes temporalidades para o antropólogo é introdução à antropologia. Né? Porque, obviamente, os nativos não pensam, nativos, onde quer que você pense de nativos, sobre nativos, que é uma categoria problemática também, obviamente, não pensam como os europeus. Né? Outra coisa, a formulação de tempo unilinear não foi feita pela modernidade europeia, ela foi feita pelos gregos muito tempo antes, através da própria noção de progresso. Né? Então, talvez seja cair nas próprias armadilhas da modernidade, achar que essa concepção organizada, hierárquica e única de destino da humanidade foi um produto da modernidade. Bom, então, voltando para a questão de como se concebe tempo, eu achei muito, muito interessante essa sua interpretação da tensão entre diferentes temporalidades como oportunidades de criação e de mudança. Né? E eu queria acrescentar uma outra, e as duas não são separadas. E aí eu estou inspirado num outro antropólogo, também bastante conhecido, Claude Lévi-Strauss, que num artigo de 1957, se não me falha a memória, chamado Raça e História, ele fala da pluralidade cultural como fonte de invenção. E eu acho que hoje, no mundo que eu vejo como pós-multiculturalista, dado o avanço do racismo pelas elites conservadoras, a gente tem muito mais a ver, está discutindo muito mais inovação política e criação teórica via tensões entre as culturas do que tensões entre temporalidades. Não é? Por isso que eu te falei, eu acho que não são excludentes. Mesmo porque o Lévi-Strauss também dizia, e eu não sou estruturalista, mas eu li muito o Lévi-Strauss e não jogo fora as coisas que me ensinam. Né? E ele dizia que só existem duas formas de você variar a experiência humana. Uma é no tempo, que é no domínio da história, e o outro é no espaço, que é o domínio da etnologia. Eu vou parar por aqui, tinha outras questões, mas não quero me prolongar. Muito obrigado, aproveitei muito das falas de vocês.
Perfect. So I think we should go once for one. So if you could answer Ken.
Depois você e depois Giovanna. Depois, tá?
Sure. So Gustavo, you made the comment that small farmers and peasants are not at all the same. And I think, thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify this. My vocabulary may have used either term because it's precisely the difference between them that I am challenging. I think this category of peasant, understood to be of a certain type, often also assigned to a certain point in history, prior, traditional, is also assumed to be risk-averse, subsistence-oriented, if engaged in markets, perhaps only local markets, right? Not basically someone who is oriented to production of a cash crop for a global market. And yet, in Southeast Asia, indigenous highlanders, like the people I studied in Sulawesi in the cocoa boom, these were indigenous highlanders with a collected land tenure system that went voluntarily with both feet completely into monocrop production of cocoa. And they did it within a period of 10 years. They transformed their own relations of production. They privatized, enclosed their own land, and began a process of class formation among themselves, which resulted in landlessness for some of them. So all of this was not the product of external force, no agribusiness corporation, no World Bank land titling scheme, nothing. It was their own desire to engage in global market production and their successful transformation of their production system to bring this about. So it's precisely the idea that this world of, small-scale agriculture can be divided between the peasant type and the commodity-producing type that I'm challenging from the perspective of Southeast Asia, right? So if I used either term peasant or smallholder, it's because in my mind, I'm not talking about different types of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Sal, for the question. I forgot to.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. Okay, let me put it this way. I think we can all agree that there are many different conceptions and experiences of time. And I think especially anthropology studied, investigated these differences in the experience of time. I think what is interesting to me, I agree with that. But then the point, again, my point is that maybe I'm just a very pragmatic and practical mind. I'm not so smart. So I would say, okay, and now what do we do with that? But now that we have so many temporalities, what do we do with that? And my point is that what if we started thinking of these temporalities when there is a real conflict between them? I said that already, but I'll give you an example. Historically speaking, if we let's read it together. Legoff and E.P. Thompson and early modernity. And I'm thinking of in E.P. Thompson the Holy Monday, when E.P. Thompson tells the story of his English workers who don't go to work on Monday because on Sunday they drink so much they are still drunk, they cannot work, and that was a kind of a habit, almost a custom that the master has to respect, but obviously not the new capitalist master. So the Holy Monday has to be erased. This is a conflict of temporalities. That is a conflict between a new economic legal regime, the capitalist, and the traditional system of habits and the way of living. Another example is given in Legoff, when the workers, says Legoff, stole the bells from the church because the bells were at the beginning of the working day. Yeah? So we can address, there is the time of the church and the time of capitalism, of the merchants. But the interesting thing is that when these two temporalities clash with each other, and then I think that this is, in my perspective, the real field of investigation. I don't know, I may be wrong, but I think that this is not what Durkheim or Levi-Strauss did. Yeah. So I think this is the work I'm doing and the work of other people, extremely important work other people did about the pluralization of times. For me, is about the tension. And the second element for me is what is the time that is unthinkable? The modern mind can easily think a plurality of times. There are every month there are at least 5-6 books on times and temporalities. Everything is a times now. But the point is what is unthinkable about time? And I give you just a very brief example. There is a term in Greek. The Greeks, they knew unilinear time, and they call it chronos. In Middle Ages, they call it a tempus. But, it's not something new. What is new is that this chronos tempus time has become dominant and has destroyed other dimension of time. This is new. But the point is, there is a time that was thinkable in Greek and is no longer thinkable, that is the kairos. And the point is, what the hell is this? And very often, there is a political reading of a kairos, and kairos seems to be the kind of a Leninist moment, the moment for the right opportunity in which you can seize power and do whatever. No, it's not. It's just not. This is just a modern secular interpretation of a kairos. Kairos requires attention with eternity and transcendence. The point is that we are not able to think that attention. We are not better than the Greeks. We cannot think what they were able to think. And this is an anthropological question. Why are we not able to think what it was possible, what it was thinkable in ancient Greece? And I think, by extension, we can say the same thing for other temporalities like Pachacuti and so on, in which time doesn't work neither as a chronos nor as a tempus, as something else. And the point is, how can we think something that is unthinkable? And when we open up that room for something unthinkable, my hope is that something unexpected can happen, politically and theoretically.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Max. We have a couple of questions, but we're also running late. So I would ask you to make them all at once, and then I'll pass the mic on to them. So,
Pode fazer em português para ele, eles vão traduzir em inglês para ele, porque aí o pessoal aqui discute também.
Boa tarde, camaradas. Eu vim estudando, tentando fazer uma história ambiental da Amazônia, da Amazônia colonial e...
Pode se apresentar pelo seu nome para ele.
Meu nome é Juliano, eu estudo aqui no PPGH, sou mestrando, e eu vim trabalhando com a Amazônia colonial e antiga, e eu fiz, eu tentei argumentar no meu exame de qualificação de que havia uma correlação entre produção de mercadoria e destruição ambiental, onde um professor me corrigiu, disse que nem sempre é assim, e citou um caso dos vinhedos na França, em que isso não ocorreu, mas queria perguntar para a professora Tania e para o professor Tomich, para saber dessa opinião de vocês, principalmente não para me provar certo, mas justamente para tentar saber um pouco mais, E professor Massimiliano, nesse movimento que eu percebi de destruição ambiental na Amazônia durante a época colonial, ela ocorre em duas frentes, Por um lado, você tem a destruição de fato da floresta para dar lugar para cultivos, etc., voltados para a produção de mercadoria, e, do outro lado, tem uma produção intelectual que percebe a natureza de uma maneira que pode ser destruída e que só é útil se transformada pelo ser humano em cultivo, produtor de mercadorias. Então, gostaria de saber sobre de que maneira a modernidade transforma o nosso pensar sobre a natureza. Obrigado.
Oi, gente.
Giovana, fica aqui na frente.
Oi, gente, boa tarde. Eu sou Giovana, eu sou aluna daqui do 4º período, daqui da UF, História, faço História, estou no 4º período, estudo Filipinas e eu queria fazer uma pergunta. Eu formulei as minhas perguntas em inglês para facilitar até a tradução. Uma pergunta para o professor Massimiliano. Eu anotei também. Okay, so you were talking about temporalities, and I was wondering, I studied colonialism. I was wondering, with the temporalities like overlapping and the whole phenomenon of like hegemonic temporalization, and that creates historiographies. How does that work and like is structured along the lines of colonialism? Like, how does that erases national histories and how that works? Because I'm studying the Philippines and I'm having a really hard time finding actual Filipino historiography, and so I have to study a bunch of different historiographies and how to know which of them are not, how to, actually that's kind of the theme of the panel, right? How to go against the brain while studying the historiographies. How do I know? How can I have that sense? And the question for Professor Tanya is a little more complex than that. Okay, so you mentioned, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the whole process of the Indonesians getting into the global market was not a necessarily violent process because they were not forced to join it and they were actually enthusiastic to join it. But at the same time, I was wondering, isn't it like necessarily a violent process, knowing that it itself is it's reformulating their their previous social structures in which there was no necessarily a global market for them to join? Like, isn't that something that came with colonialism and with the encounter with capitalistic societies? There's a book that mentions that the whole global market insertion of Asia is something that came with capitalism, because so far there were no such thing as a global market, not even a big like integration. It's called Asia as a Method and something else. That's the title. And I was wondering, how is that not necessarily? It's not necessarily violent per se because it's not aggressive, but isn't it also violent because it reformulates and it deconstructs their previous social and economic structures? That's it. É isso, gente. Obrigada.
Giovanna, Fred.
Tem que apresentar também. Alonso, Frederico, estão aí no sexto período de história. Queria fazer uma pergunta para o Max em relação a essa questão da temporalização. Você falando me lembrou bastante o François Hartog, o livro de regime de historicidade, de historicité, que ele fala exatamente sobre essa questão das articulações que os homens fazem no presente, do passado e do futuro. Você falou uma coisa que me chamou bastante a atenção, que você defendeu que a temporalização da Idade Média seria mais dinâmica do que na Idade Moderna, não é? Sim. Sim, ouvi direito. Ok, legal. Agora vai ficar interessante. Porque essa questão da temporalização, acho que você colocou um ponto muito bom, que é que ela surge de uma crise, né? Uma crise necessita uma resposta, e a temporalização seria essa resposta. Mas uma questão também muito interessante do tempo é a gente pensar quase que eu chamaria de tempo ontológico, o tempo do trabalho, o tempo do cotidiano, que no fundo é esse tempo que eu diria que seria predominante das relações sociais dos homens. E quando a gente olha para a Idade Média, que é uma sociedade bastante ruralizada, é o que eu estudo, é por isso que eu estou aqui tendo coragem de fazer essa pergunta. Você tem muito essa questão da interabilidade do tempo, das estações, e isso é muito na produção do plantio e desse tempo cíclico. E eu fico pensando que essas questões da temporalização, elas surgem de crise, mas de onde essas crises vêm? Você usou muito a palavra ser concreto, né? Eu acho que o lugar mais concreto que nós podemos chegar de análise são as relações sociais entre os homens. Por isso que eu acho que aquela frase do Marx, no começo do Manifesto Comunista, que é tudo que é sólido se desmancha no ar. Por que o que é sólido se desmancha no ar? Porque você começa a ter justamente uma mudança muito brusca nessas relações sociais. Então, eu fico pensando assim, não acho que tenha tanta mais dinamidade relativa, justamente porque você precisa, para que essa temporalização aconteça, mudanças ontológicas na vida dos homens. E o quão drásticas elas são, porque justamente a questão da formação do capital é justamente a dinamização, o aumento das mediações, o aumento das dependências que são necessárias para a reprodução dos homens em sociedade. Enquanto a gente olha para a medievalidade, eu acho que as relações, as mediações nos mostram um tipo de tempo ontológico da vida cotidiana bem diferente, que eu não sei se é tão dinâmico, mais dinâmico como você coloca. Eu gostaria que você falasse um pouco mais sobre isso, porque eu acho realmente muito vital para a gente estar entendendo o capitalismo contra o tempo, essa questão que é o tempo ontológico das produções das relações sociais e como as crises, justamente nesse tempo da produção, vão exigir respostas. Né? Essa ideia de temporalização do Maquiavel me parece muito como você tem uma particularização de uma condição a fim das finalidades de um grupo. E isso surge dessa crise. Eu, olhando para a medievalidade, não acho que a gente tenha tanta dinamicidade justamente nesse aspecto ontológico do tempo para dizer que esse tempo é mais dinâmico. Eu tenho sido claro. Desculpa, gostei muito também das apresentações. O que você falou, adoro história e filosofia. Quero ver a sua resposta aí, estou ansioso.
Fred, doidinho da cabeça. Boa tarde, gente, todo mundo. Obrigado aos professores pela mesa, foi excelente, acho que todo mundo aqui tirou muitas contribuições de tudo. Minha pergunta para o professor Massimiliano, acho que é um pouco mais simples. Dentro do que o professor falou sobre a modernidade como uma época que produz outras épocas, e principalmente dentro dessa ideia de que os momentos de conflito, os momentos de tensão são justamente os momentos onde a gente tem maior produção de possibilidades e a história pode atuar de forma política dentro disso também. Minha pergunta é como o professor pensa justamente o âmbito político dentro desses momentos, né? Então, não só pensar a modernidade e a história como possibilidades de fazer política, de certa forma, mas como pensar a política nesse processo de, vamos dizer assim, autorreprodução da modernidade ou, enfim, confirmação dessas ideias de modernidade e modernização. Então, seria meio que uma inversão do que o professor falou na exposição, né? Em vez de pensar a história e a modernidade como política, pensar qual é o papel da política nessa formação da modernização e da modernidade. Obrigado.
Obrigado a todos os palestrantes, valeu aí. Realmente gostei muito. Meu nome é João, eu sou do 6º período de História também, da graduação. E eu tenho 2 perguntas, uma para a Tanya e outra para o Max. Para a Tanya, eu queria saber, a gente ouviu a palestra, né, com várias informações em relação ao modo de produção. E aí eu gostaria também de perguntar se existe alguma possibilidade da gente identificar um padrão na qualidade desses produtos, no sentido de que, pensando a agricultura brasileira, nós temos um movimento de desmantelamento de uma agricultura familiar em prol de um agronegócio, como o professor falou também. E esse desmantelamento gera, de certa forma, no mercado interno, uma redução da qualidade em prol dessa grande produtividade. Como você trabalhando, como você expôs na sua apresentação, a gente consegue entender que não necessariamente o grande significa moderno e melhor. Então, justamente essa movimentação, a gente poderia identificar, então, um certo padrão nessas plantations de redução de algumas coisas que a gente considera básicas, como qualidade dos produtos, como melhores condições de trabalho para as pessoas que trabalham nessas plantações, em favor desse lucro e desse movimento de aumentar a produção e de fazer a manutenção desse mito de que o agronegócio seria a evolução da produção agrícola, né? E para o Max, mais um comentário, né? Pedir uma oportunidade, porque a história intelectual italiana me intriga bastante. E eu tenho várias questões, já fiz até um curso na UF aqui relacionado a isso. E quando você fala sobre esses momentos de tensão na história, eu gostaria de trazer um estudo que a gente fez, né, na aula de História e Filosofia aqui da UF, do Giuseppe Duzzo, que é um historiador intelectual, né, da Itália, que vai trabalhar essa ideia de história conceitual como filosofia política. E é justamente nesse ponto, o ponto que você trouxe para a gente, que é esses momentos de tensão como forma de entender, ou seja, os conceitos, né, como forma de ser uma projeção e não paralisar a história. Então, o conceito em si não tem história, mas ele serve, né, como uma forma de identificar os nossos contextos, tornando, assim, os textos que a gente lê na faculdade, né, um contexto para a gente. Então, são textos contextualizados e vice-versa, né, como um comum pertencer, como a gente poderia falar na filosofia. E aí eu trago uma questão, que é a questão contemporânea do Duzzo, relacionada ao conceito de representatividade política, que o Duzzo vai dizer que é a nossa principal tônica das discussões políticas hoje, é o conceito de representatividade. Então, numa oportunidade de tentar aplicar o método que a gente teve, que você apresentou para a gente aqui na palestra, eu gostaria que você comentasse um pouco sobre como que essa representatividade é um ponto de tensão entre o Estado democrático de direito, ou seja, o Estado liberal burguês, e as demandas da sociedade na contemporaneidade, né? Aí trazer um exemplo anterior, né? o que a gente estudou no curso, por exemplo, o conceito de poder, o conceito de Estado, ele aparece aqui na polis grega, no Império Medieval, no Império Romano, e no próprio Estado moderno. Mas o conceito de poder ele se modifica dentro de todas essas categorias, né? Então, pensando a representatividade nessa mesma lógica, você seria partidário da tese do Dulles, a representatividade política seria, então, o conceito atual em tensão para nos demonstrar, para fazer um paralelo com as possibilidades de futuro que a gente tem? Seria basicamente essa a minha pergunta. Obrigado e é isso aí. Não tem muito mais o que falar.
So the last question, Gustavo.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Sou Gustavo Coutinho, sou orientando do professor Tomich. Sou orientando do professor Tomich. Ok. Pesquiso espacialidade no século XIX e tento aplicar métodos de georreferenciamento no Caribe e no Recôncavo Baiano. Minha pergunta, em especial, à professora Tanya Lee e especialmente ao professor Tomich, que é minha referência na minha pesquisa, e ao professor Tomba também. Primeiro, professor Tomba, o senhor falou da sincronização dessas temporalidades através dessas fricções, né, e dessas múltiplas temporalidades e suas distinções. E a pergunta é: quais são as condições dessa sincronização da Revolução Francesa no Haiti, uma vez que as resultantes dessas fricções, dessas temporalidades, são distintas na formação e nas mudanças para a leitura e interpretação desses blocos, em condições totalmente diferentes de formação? Primeira pergunta. E para a professora Lee e para o professor Tomich, como alocar e interpretar o determinismo geográfico nas relações de produção desses lugares, os quais os senhores pesquisam, e se a falta, a ausência de investimento tecnológico nessas zonas de plantation impactam nos dados e interpretações das pesquisas, das respectivas pesquisas. E a pergunta seria se dentro da lógica do capitalismo, né, o investimento, os recursos e investimentos, uma vez que dentro dessas zonas você não consegue estender mais a escala de produtividade, se o capitalismo ele potencializa dentro de uma racionalidade econômica esses investimentos para estender a produção escalonada, em um último caso somente, uma vez que dentro de uma breve história comparada, a gente consegue ter como consequência sempre o investimento do capital como a última consequência depois de exaurido todas as condições, principalmente do determinismo geográfico. Muito obrigado, boa tarde.
Thank you so much for all your questions. So, just for organization purposes, we started 15 minutes late, and if we do until 5:45, we do 3 hours instead of 2.5. So let's try to keep it within 5:45. Is that okay for you guys? Like, I know it's hard because they were difficult and complex questions, but there is the translating team, and they also have their labor time. So, Dale. Could you go first, Dale?
Let me think for a moment here. I think we have to pick. Oh, is there a button here? What do I do? This? Oh my gosh. Unmute. Hello? Oh, it's here. There's a button here. Hang on. Can you hear me? Yes? Now? Okay, I can't hear me there. Okay. I think I would like to think about not plantations in general, but think about the historical evolution of plantations within a process of the formation and transformations of capital. So that's why I tried to distinguish these three different cycles of slavery. And I would say I would distinguish the slave plantations from other kinds of plantations. Tanya made me think, if you look at the Brazil in the 16th century or the Caribbean in the 18th century, the transformations of environment were minimal. But if you look at Mississippi and Louisiana now, the environmental transformations that make agriculture and plantation possible in the Mississippi Delta or in Louisiana are enormous. I mean, the whole Mississippi River is channeled to keep the floods out and to keep the irrigation going. I mean, it's a scale of environmental change and social change that simply wouldn't have been possible before. So the plantation changes with the capacity of capital to make it change. And I can't help but add in, because I think it relates to Tanya's talk. The interesting thing about the Mississippi Delta is exactly as Black tenant farmers were struggling for civil rights in the 60s, they were being massively appropriated by corporate agriculture at the exact same time. And a lot of the agricultural transformation meant migration to the north, not all of it. So there's these changes that Tanya's getting at are really complex and can be different in different places. There's no one magic key, and I think she's opening up a very fruitful path to think about. So I want to get back to, if I understood I don't remember the questions anymore, but the environment. I've never tried to think about modes of production, but I think slave labor is a kind of commodity production, and look at the commodity. And I think the commodity interests me because it's the unity of use value and exchange value. And I did a book with Rafael Marchesi and my Cuban colleagues on plantation landscapes that I hope desperately will come out in Portuguese someday soon, but I don't have any clue. But it's about landscape, and it was interesting because I think landscape it was a way of bringing in environment and material production into the social relations of slavery. And I think our slavery history is entirely, if I can use the word, sociocentric. It doesn't have people doing material production in real environments where it matters whether there's a flood or a rain or a drought. And each kind of crop has a different labor process, a different organization of the slave population, different modes of using land, and different modes of social control. And we don't, I always told my students that, well, you come to my apartment and there's 110 books on sugar and slavery in. And they're all the same book. They're just local variations of the same thing. And they all begin with one paragraph about the environment and one paragraph about how to make sugar. And then we forget about it. And I think that's just terribly wrong. So if I understood the last question, the question to me properly, what I think, it goes back to what I was trying to say, that there's no labor in a slave plantation. Slaves are capital. And the slave labor force has to be adjusted to land and to the instruments of production. You can't save labor. And the problem is you have too much labor. If you do something labor saving, what do you do with those people? It becomes a problem. And so slavery in general expands by putting more people on more land. And at a certain point, if you take the Recôncavo, you fill it up. And then there's continually world market pressures for, let's say, more sugar. And there's competition from France and from Britain with Portugal over the emerging sugar market. So how does slavery respond? It responds by opening up new land. But the new land is somewhere else. So that's where I think Jason Moore's idea of commodity frontiers is very fruitful. New frontiers of commodity production form on those new frontiers, new technologies can be implemented. So if you look at the French and British Caribbean, they actually used what Antonil called the engenhoca, which didn't do much in Brazil, and it became the basis of the more productive use of land and slave labor in the Caribbean. And then the point I wanted to make, and why I was talking about the Enlightenment and mercantilism, is that I think with the whole point of slavery is slavery runs through personal domination of the enslaved, and you squeeze work out of them. There's no market mechanism. There's no economic calculation. You try to get the most out of what you got. And so that's why Aristotle remains an important consideration. That's the language of personal domination, the whole notion of planter paternalism, et cetera, et cetera. But in the Caribbean, it's reconfigured. The Enlightenment gets rid of the baggage of Antonil's religious view of the world. It interprets the Oikos in a secular way, and there everything is measured. The way sugar, land and means of production are used to produce sugar becomes totally calculable, and slaves are adapted to it, but they have to fit a calculated system of work. And the discipline is to enforce a certain speed. And sugar I like because you have to integrate all the sectors of sugar production. It already, even in its crudest forms, has an industrial work discipline. And then you would go to my second slavery, and you incorporate industrial technologies into the sugar plantation and the railroad and all sorts of things. It blows apart the whole notion of the limits of slavery, but adapts the slave labor to it. And what I think is very telling is Francisco Arango Pareño, who was the architect of the Cuban sugar revolution, still has the Aristotelian framework. He talks about the need to govern, but to govern economically, so that the Cubans are now treating slaves not as servants, but as labor. And here I think Rafael Marquesi's book on the fetor, whatever that is, the slave management, is just right on the mark. They have to manage slaves as if they're not labor, but they're not in a relation where labor is something that you can directly touch. So Cuba takes it as far as it can go. I would say the Valle Paraiba takes slavery as far as it can go. And after slavery, you have to, what happens is agriculture and sugar, agriculture gets separated from the manufacturing part. And then you can introduce crudely some other kind of calculation. So it's constantly, within slavery, expanding to new commodity frontiers, reorganizing the plantation. By the end of the 19th century, that ends, but it ends in different interesting ways that have to do with the crop. That in Brazil, coffee goes to the Oeste Paulista and we get immigration in colonos. In Cuba, the former slave labor force is proletarianized. They become wage workers. And in the American South, the planters lose their capital, but the demand for labor through racism ties black labor to the land. So there's different kinds of outcomes, and it's all very flexible. And what I learned listening to Tanya and Max and thinking about this, about my own presentation, I think what I'm beginning to see is that the planter temporality is not a separate layer. It's built into capital accumulation. So I'm thinking more and more as a capital accumulation as a kind of arc that has different possibilities on different poles. And what interests me is that the planters are reproducing themselves as non-capitalists within a totally capitalist process of accumulation. And at every stage of the development of the plantation, they're re-articulating themselves as non-capitalist, as aristocratic, et cetera, and it's, I don't know what happened in the United States, but 2 years ago when we had Black Lives Matter and indigenous peoples movements, all this was exploding to the fore, and you had the old Southern elite of the Republican Party going back to, oh no, we represent a different kind of hierarchical civilization, and these things were all necessary. Formal equality is not something that historically has served our interest. So I don't know, playing with it, and what Tanya's making me think about is that the modernity and non-modernity of the plantation may be in part a matter of perspective. That in Indonesia or in Brazil or in Cuba, the plantation can present itself as modern. But from the point of view of New York or London, it looks backward, or Amsterdam. And the planters themselves can be modern when they want to be. We have to make these people into sharecroppers because this is the only way out. Or they can have recourse to these traditional values. So I think the temporality thing and how it can be manipulated becomes very interesting. I'll stop there. I can't hear you.
Contribution to this seminar needs to go. And I think that we can go in English from now on. So I'd like to thank them. Everybody, please, a shout of applause. Thank you so much. And so, Tanya, be next.
Sure.
Oi? E quem tem um aparelho de ouvido, por favor, deixar ali na saída.
They want you. So I'll just start because I'm sure everyone wants to go home. So thank you for the questions, which I think are actually quite a nice series from me. So thank you. So first of all, the question of environmental destruction of the forest, destruction of the Amazon, in order to produce crops. So I think people have always farmed, and farming in most places requires cutting down trees. So the question of nature as something separate, which is sacred, which needs to be preserved, is perhaps quite a modern notion actually, and I think it coincides with scarcity. In the areas where I've worked on, which are usually on forest frontiers, indigenous people see the forest as endless, as infinite, not something which is scarce and has to be carefully managed and preserved, but something which, yes, of course you will cut down some trees because how else are you going to have a garden, right? So you have to think about what are we assuming about people's relationships to nature when we think of indigenous people and the Amazon, and suddenly can think only in terms of tree loving and conservation. Of course, this is very different from the scale of ecological destruction which is going on in the Amazon now, which has nothing to do with indigenous people's uses of forested land, for their own survival. So the second question from Giovanna, is it not violent for people to begin to trade, be engaged in markets? And here I would suggest, let's think about the Mediterranean. Thousands of years ago, farmers all around the Mediterranean were both producing and trading. The Mediterranean is a place of many different micro environments. One place could be good for growing olive oil, something else for weaving cloth. People engaged in production and trade and exchange historically quite separate from questions of colonialism. This is also true in Southeast Asia. It's like the Mediterranean. It's a great big archipelago, as I showed on the map. And people have always engaged in trade. So you collect something, some trader arrives who wants this thing, that's going to offer you a piece of cloth or a piece of Chinese ceramics, which has been imported. People are tempted by these goods, purposes of prestige and consumption. So I don't think we should imagine that all forms of commerce are, captured by the logic of the colonial or even the violent or the destructive. Where it becomes violent is actually, in this case, in Southeast Asian case, where all of this diverse trade and production is suppressed, is coerced, is monopolized in order to impose the monopoly, in this case of the Dutch East Indies Company and eventually the British and Dutch empires. So I think we have to step away from this idea that the natural way of being is non-commercial or does not involve, commerce, exchange, production, and all of the riches and of quality of life that it has always given to humans. We don't produce everything that we like, that we want to use, that we value. We're going to get it from someone else. On the question of the quality of the production and dismantling of family farms. So, I thinking about this, here I sit in Canada and I can buy a mango for $1. And this seems to me a total scandal because I have to think, what kinds of conditions of production, what kinds of transportation device, like what has been discounted in terms of the value of land and labor and the fossil fuel and the container ship which brought the mango to me, right? Something crazy is going on in the world of global food production and circulation, which makes my mango that I buy in a Canadian supermarket so cheap. And I cannot believe it is all to do with productive efficiency. It's to do with forms of subsidy, manipulation of prices, tariffs, and many other things. So I think the question of, who produces what quality of food at what price, in my country still, locally produced food is expensive food. Cheap food is mass-produced and industrial food. But I don't think this is intrinsic to the efficiency of industrial production. You could say it's a setup, right? It's a way in which different kinds of labor and land and services have been priced and valued and brought together, which produces this phenomenon of global cheap food. The question of technical economy of scale is the third question, and that really is varied, right? And I think in Brazil you may have a problem in that the massive scale production of soy probably is a case where there is a technical economy of scale with producing of this crop on the way in which it's produced now in the Cerrado, right? But as it happens, many plantation crops do not respond to a technical economy of scale because they are labor intensive. And it's not obvious that machines are going to be used or will make it more efficient. So most plantation crops have become, in fact, smallholder crops because smallholders turn out to be more efficient and there are no technical economies of scale. Even sugar now is mainly grown by smallholders, not so much in Brazil, but elsewhere. So I think this question of the lack of technological advance, again, you have to ask, like, how is labor being priced and what really is the technology, and is it something which is driving this mode of production, or is it other forms of politically supported and organized subsidies to land and labor, which produces the appearance of the technically efficient plantation? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Max would like to have the last words.
Okay, thank you for all of your questions, great questions and difficult questions. Let me start, which one? I try to put together some of them, but maybe I should start with this because it's kind of autobiographical. If the question, I don't remember who asked me the question about the DUSO. Yeah, I worked with the DUSO for 15 years at the University of Padua. So I was a student and then I worked with him in the seminar on the conceptual history and so on. And I was part of the permanent seminar. And then at a certain point, this is what happens in every family. You break up and then you divorce and you start a new life. And that happened to us or to me. What is the main difference, let me put it this way, between the work of Dussel and my work and how I see our differences? Is that basically, I would say, that for Dussel, if there is a tension, it's a tension between modernity, the modern state, and politics, and something that took place in early modernity, and then he has early modern thinkers like Althusius, and then he plays with this tension. In early modernity, we don't have the typical concept of a political modernity, representation, people's sovereignty, and so on. And he plays with this tension in order to criticize modern concepts, modern political concepts, in order to show their limits. What I'm doing is, I would say, is quite different, because I would say that Dussel is still working with a unilinear historical time. So it's basically modernity versus Althusius and other thinkers in early modernity, or we can go back. What I'm doing is I play the tension between, let's call it this is a term that the Dussel doesn't use, a tension between the dominant political modernity, the state, representation, and so on, and the many other trajectories of modernity. And these other trajectories of modernity are characterized by something that is incommensurable, incompatible with the dominant modernity. For example, the dispersed sovereignties of the many assemblies in the 1792-93 of the French Revolution, the Sans-Culottes assemblies, the Paris Commune, the German councils in the German Revolution, and so there are many, many examples. So these, so you can see now my difference. The first difference, I don't work, or I try not to work with the big thinkers, Althusius versus the dominant modernity. I work with a kind of a collective, anonymous insurgents. They are my theorists, the communards and the Sans-Culottes. They do theory in action. And in their theory in action, they show us different ways to go or to practice modernity. And these other trajectories coexist. They are just different layers of what we call modernity. And then there is always this tension between the dominant one and all these other dimensions that re-emerge. And when they re-emerge, they reconfigure the present in a new way. And then you have a conflict that can be more or less intense and so on. So I can say, unless he changed his mind in the last 3 years, Dussel is not interested in this kind of story. He doesn't care. This is how I left Giuseppe Dussel. And I think it was good to clarify, because in a certain way it helps me to clarify my own perspective. Another question that is crucial, is important, and is very difficult, is about how the conception of nature and conception of time are intertwined, or how they can affect each other. So how our conception of nature assumes a specific conception of time. I think the missing link between time and nature is that is a book that has to be written. I think the missing link between time and nature is a property, is a private property. I have to be honest, when people talk about nature, without talking about the property, I get bored or I leave the room. Because it doesn't make sense, what does it mean, And why I'm saying that nature is so important, because the property is so important, because it defines the way we represent and we understand the nature. So when John Locke says that the value of a thing, of a product, is 99 or more % constituted by our labor, and 1% or less is a nature in itself. It's not providing a theory of the labor value, is the relation between labor and value. It's justifying a property by a devaluation of nature, by considering nature a piece of shit. Then this trajectory goes on, and Hegel basically can consider nature an obstacle. If our will is a free, infinite will, and our will has to expand, nature is there as an obstacle to the possible infinite expansion of our will. How can we overcome the famous Aufhebung? How can we overcome this obstacle? Through appropriation. And then property becomes an extension of my own will. Now, the tricky thing of this story is what? Is that we like infinite free will. We like to represent ourselves as an infinite free will. But we don't see the implication that then you buy infinite free will, the freedom to do whatever I want. I don't want a limit. I don't want obligations. This is how modernity begins. It was a nice dream of a freedom and liberation. But when we buy the dream, we buy property, private property. We buy the categories of the modern state. We buy sovereignty. We buy representation. We buy power. We buy. There is an entire package of categories that we buy with this dream. So the point is, are we able to question infinite free will, the freedom of doing whatever we want? This is the thing. Then it requires some interesting theoretical, political terms. And about time, I can see one single, and then I will stop. And one very, very simple thing that maybe is related to other questions. So I would say private property can be represented in terms of a time of temporality as an absolutization of the present, of the temporality of the present. What does it mean? It means that the private property was born with an invention, was born by cheating, was born by a forgery, was born by inventing a Latin term that doesn't exist in Roman law. The Latin term that doesn't exist in Roman law is jus utendi et abutendi. This is the definition of a property that you can find in the French civil code. And this is the definition of property that you can find in many, many handbooks. Mm-hmm. It doesn't exist. It's not Roman law. They made up some Latin in order to give property the aura of something that is meta-historical. Oh, look, this is the entire history of property. No, it's false. It's not true. And we have evidence now. So I can cite all the... So this is not... So basically, the modern property as absolutization of the present is an invention. Then one can say, then we needed to point out of the temporality of the future, because climate change is coming, because the apocalypse is coming. I would say, this is also not the solution. And maybe it's even worse than the absolutization of the present. Because what you can get with this emphasis on the future is what? Or the sense of urgency. And when you have the sense of urgency, emergency, you need the state. You need the power. You need the new laws which can control industries and productions and pollutions and so on. So basically, you are going back into the temporality of the state. Because the future is how the temporality of the future is the temporality of the state. The state is there in order to control the future. And the sense of urgency, emergency, comes together with the state of emergency. If there is an emergency, the state says, I'm here. Let's suspend the laws and let's make new laws in a new state of exception. I think this is not the way to go. So then, the only available temporality is now the past. So what do we gain if we understand nature through the temporality of the past? I think we can gain something. That is basically that we gain. Even Marx went there in volume 3 of Capital. What you gain is the sense of a continuity. You need to think in terms of a property. So you don't own land, you don't own water, you don't own these things. You borrow these things, you take care of these things, and you can use these things, and then you give back. So basically, you think in terms of generations, you think in terms of continuity of time, and you cannot think in terms of a property. You can think in terms of borrowing thing. Marx went there. There is a passage in volume 3, and it is an interesting passage because he has to use many Latin terms in order to describe what he has in mind. So what? A form of a possession that is not property. And is this possible? Yes, it's possible because we have so many examples of a form of a use and possession which are not property. But again, it requires a very different way of thinking time and our political categories. Very last thing, and I will be really super short, brief. And on I think there are many others, but on synchronization, the only thing I want to say is, I think because it's related to our conversation, I think on synchronization, I think we have to the other talks I think went in this direction. We have to think in terms of a kind of a temporal islands. But the point is that these islands are no longer islands when they encounter each other. And then you have what I like. You have this kind of a friction and tension between different temporalities. So for that reason, I think there was a question that went in this direction. For that reason, I never use the word ontological time. Actually, I never use the word ontology. I think you can Google my works. I never use the term ontology. I have a kind of an allergy for it. And everything is ontology and ontological. I never use it. Maybe because I don't understand what does it mean. I don't know. It's possible. But so they are no longer.
It's theology.
I like theology, but I don't like ontology. So they are no longer ontological island when they encounter each other. They become something else. So what is my point? My point is very simple. The point is that I don't give priority to temporality 1 or over temporality 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. I think a priority has to be given to the tension that defines both temporalities. So, for example, if we study, let's say, colonialism, I think it's very easy to understand how the legal dominant framework of a colonialism, international law, affected and even destroyed existing legal systems. The point is how the conquest, how the encounter retroact and affected what we call international law. So these two dimensions, they change together when they are in tension with each other. And I think a lot of what we call international law is the result, not only of a colonization, but I would say is the result of the many resistance against colonization. If there is a starting point, this is my methodology. If I have to work on that, my starting point would be the many resistances against the colonization as a legal, theoretical beginning, starting point to understand the development of international law. So, and this is, back to the first citation. I think this is the kind of a methodology that I borrowed and developed from Walter Benjamin. This is my understanding of reading history against the grain. That's it.
Oh, thank you so much.
So, as everybody has seen, this panel has raised the bar, and we're very happy to have had you all here. Thank you so much for your talks and presentations and answers to all questions. Thank you, Dale, for coming along from so far away. All right, we will talk later, Dale. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening.
Bye-bye, enjoyed it.
Boa noite a todo mundo também. Obrigado, pessoal.
Thank you. Thank you for your